Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Brent Greene. I'm a lecturer in landscape architecture and the program manager of RMIT's Bachelor of Landscape Architectural Design. The title of my paper and presentation is That's KAMP, Speculative Landscape Architectural Approaches Towards Queer Memorialisation in Melbourne. This presentation discusses my pedagogical approach towards producing queer memorial concepts in St Kilda, which is a suburb of Melbourne, through a landscape architecture design studio. The presentation is structured in three parts. The first section discusses the studio's philosophical positioning in queer ecological theory and its application to the design of queer memorials. Second, I'll introduce the context of St Kilda and briefly provide an overview of its evolving queer heritage during the 20th and 21st centuries. And lastly, I introduce the design studio approach to explain how my students engaged with queer narratives and theory and utilized creative tactics such as photo essays, computational modeling and simulation, ecological design and drawing to iterate and refine a queer memorial in St Kilda. I'd like to acknowledge my student Sylvie Zhang as the author of this design work and thank her for allowing me to showcase her excellent memorial design process and outcome to a wider audience. So some of the major themes running through this conference include ideas of hybridity, mixing and interdisciplinarity. And in light of that, I would like to thank my collaborators who were very generous in giving their time to me and my students as we explored the memorial designs. So that includes the Victorian Pride Centre, which is located in St Kilda, James Brearley from Bow Architects and Urbanists, who is the lead architect of the Victorian Pride Centre, and Dr. Catherine Barrett from Alice's Garage, who is a social enterprise group dedicated to empowering elderly LGBTIQ plus A people located in Melbourne. So the following slides introduce the concept of queer ecology and briefly explain how this philosophy was utilised through the design studio pedagogy. For those unfamiliar with the word queer, it has traditionally been utilised by non-queer people as a derogatory term to describe gay people as either strange or unusual. However, more recently, many, but not all, members of the rainbow community have embraced the term to describe themselves, a mechanism to reduce, reframe, or erase the discriminatory and derogatory impact of the word on the community. Now, queer theory is a critical discourse that was introduced in the late 20th century by Teresa de Lauretis. At its core, the theory reframes sexuality and gender from a fixed or binary state to one that is more dynamic and constantly shifting. In comparison, ecology is a much older discipline, first emerging in Europe during the 19th century and was understood as a scientific investigation into the relationship of the organism to the environment. So at this time, European scientists who were operating regionally and internationally examined how taxa evolved and sustained themselves in surrounding environmental conditions. So notable investigations include von Humboldt's study into the impact of environmental and atmospheric conditions on plant communities, Lamarck's early explorations into how species adapted to their surroundings in response to environmental pressures, and Lyell's investigation into the influence of geological processes on existing ecological communities. So it's important to note that these 19th century ideas began an ongoing discussion concerning the performance of ecological communities and provoked new theoretical positions such as the notion of equilibrium. And while principles of ecology were rigorously debated at this time, most scientists were unified in regards to what types of spaces were best suited for research. So intact environments, or those sites considered unmodified by humans, were seen as best suited for ecological research as the processes that impacted their development were considered natural in origin and had not yet been impacted by human actions. So, queer ecology, which is distinct to ecological science, considers and acknowledges conditions that does not necessarily align with normative ecological perceptions and values. For instance, the concept of a pure or untouched wilderness. It explores ideas of reproduction, the binary between urban and rural landscapes, and the very notion of naturalness. In the context of the urban landscape, queer ecological conditions and processes can include the growth of spontaneous plant communities, fluid environmental aesthetics such as polluted soils and water, and cultural performances such as public sex. Queer ecological theory, therefore, understands the inherent value in the other and queer landscape traits and processes. A theoretical position which became central to the studio pedagogy. So these ideas, in addition to the memorialisation practice, were explored in St Kilda, which is a centrally located bayside suburb of Melbourne. So in the post-war period, St Kilda was renowned for its bohemian atmosphere, which was supportive of internationally prominent artists alongside varying subcultures, including LGBTIQ plus A people. And many in Melbourne's queer community were drawn to living in St Kilda. It offered cheap and readily available one-bedroom accommodation, which allowed for the growth of the queer community, especially among homosexual men. There are a series of hospitality venues that were very supportive of gays and lesbians, including the Prince of Wales Hotel, which still exists today. And there's a photo there in the bottom left hand of the screen with a famous trans security guard that worked both the door and behind the bar. And public facilities such as the St Kilda Sea Bars, which we can see on the right. And traditionally, this segregated visitors into either men or women zones. And because of that, that became a really important meeting place for homosexual men for casual sexual encounters. However, from the 1990s onwards, many of these queer spaces have been lost or severely impacted through gentrification. So during this time, the suburb did become increasingly gentrified following the emergence of new civic and residential projects, which included the renovation of queer pubs, the redevelopment of, say, rooming houses into luxury apartments, and the kind of cleaning up of the streets that were considered unsightly for international tourists as well as residents, the demographic of which were becoming increasingly middle class from 1990 onwards. As a consequence of this gentrification, our students were then challenged to offer novel design visions for St Kilda, which acknowledge the suburb's ongoing gentrification while revealing and celebrating the historical narratives of its queer community. Now, these memorial explorations would be sited at the Jackson Street car park, which you can see here on the centre of the screen, which is located adjacent to the Victorian Pride Centre, which opened in 2020. The final part of the presentation introduces the studio pedagogy, discussing how students engaged queer philosophy, queer ecological conditions and processes through landscape architectural design. As stated previously, the impact of gentrification on St Kilda's queer ecology strongly influenced the studio's positioning and methods of analysis. During the first phase of design research, studio participants utilised photo essays and sectional drawings, which explored the material and ecological qualities of St Kilda's marginalised and queer spaces, speculative landscape drawings and models, which explored the role of topography and spontaneous plant materials in expressing queer narratives, and literature reviews and precedent studies, which included analysing and drawing notable designs such as the Homo Monument, the AIDS quilt, the Memorial to Homosexuals Persecuted under Nazism, and the Transgender Memorial Garden. Photo essays and diagrams were composed to map the aesthetic, environmental, experiential, and queer qualities of St Kilda's most marginalised spaces. A common theme of the investigations included the impact of abandonment on the landscape's constructed elements together with its queer plant communities, which stand in opposition to the suburb's gentrification forces. For instance, these photographs and diagrams examined the ecological and cultural performances of St Kilda's marginalised spaces, revealing practices such as unplanned plant growth and public sex. These studies were complemented by speculative diagrams, such as those seen on the right, which communicate how queer conditions might be adjusted through the process of gentrification. The discovery of such queer conditions, together with insights from the community consultation, were major influences on the development of multiple memorial design concepts. Following these preliminary studies, studio participants engaged in a co-led workshop with Dr. Catherine Barrett from Alice's Garage, who sourced a range of queer life experiences from gay men, lesbian women, bisexuals, and trans people. Critically, this workshop allowed students, some of which had no prior knowledge of queer communities, to study unfamiliar narratives and interpret them through paper modelling, drawing, and topographic design. Responding to these narratives, students produced a series of fabulous drawings and models, which are described by Lawson as highly speculative drawings having an intention to express wonderful and fantastic qualities. These drawings are not used to test an idea, but rather to let it flourish and develop. They often represent something that, in fact, could not exist. Inspired by this position, students created powerful, although abstract drawings and models that express the community members' emotional experiences of grief and pride and translated them through a series of topographic explorations. This section elevation, which is an extreme topography, is inspired by Celeste's experience of transitioning, which she described as anxious and isolating for a period of time. As Celeste reflects, to me, pride is all about accepting all parts of me, the sad parts, the good parts, the bad parts as well. Grief, to me, as an LGBTIQ+A person, is about a lot of things that I've had to give up to live as who I am. I had to give up how I was raised by my family and everything I was taught about how the world is supposed to be. After gleaning knowledge from site observation, drawing, community consultation, precedent studies, and literature reviews, studio participants then harnessed 3D modelling and digital simulation programs to test and design ecological processes which aligned to their queer memorial design concept. The example discussed in this presentation is named Shifting Paradise, a memorial to transgender experience by Sylvie Zhang. During the iteration phase, the site's topography was tested to develop new drainage patterns while establishing new sight lines and spatial configurations, which aim to express the transgender experience shared through community consultation. Flow channels were developed with the assistance of a Grasshopper plugin, which allowed for the strategic design of collection and retention areas, which created microclimatic conditions that would best support the growth of queer plant communities on site. These explorations were further tested against a sun and shade analysis, which reinforced locations best suited to fostering queer plant growth. In the final phase of refinement, hardscape materials were inserted into the site to strengthen the surface's ability to direct and retain water, while offering visitors to the memorial clear walking paths and resting areas. The realised memorial employed queer ecological processes as a metaphor to depict the pride and grief of the transgender community. A variety of queer plants, in addition to a managed butterfly and sunflower garden, are intended to evolve in unexpected ways across multiple annual cycles. Stone pavers encouraged a circulation experience around the memorial rather than a direct linear path from the site boundaries. In addition, they influenced unplanned and unmaintained plant growth among the cracks of the stepping stones and created high humidity environments for queer plants such as the bristly ox tongue. Lastly, the memorial is intended to perform differently across Melbourne's seasons, emphasising the notion of dynamics, transition, and evolution. For instance, in summer, all members of the community are encouraged to tend to the sunflower garden as a means to encourage notions of pride through planting, care, and maintenance. While in winter, many of the queer plants die or become dormant as a means to express the concept of grief. Together, the memorial's constantly evolving spatial and ecological qualities become representative of a community with high degrees of resiliency and self-understanding. Together, these ecological design decisions result in a queer memorial which achieves multiple outcomes concurrently. The design establishes a new memorial typology in St Kilda, namely a designed queer ecology that exhibits and celebrates the suburb's queer heritage. By engaging these attributes through design and design education, the memorial offers an alternative approach towards designing memorial landscapes in the suburb that challenges the status quo of gentrification. Lastly, by embracing queer ecological theory and by working with multiple collaborators from the disciplines of design, local government, and the queer community, this pedagogical approach has enhanced studio participants' knowledge, appreciation, and empathy towards a community that is often marginalised by those with decision-making powers. Thank you for watching my presentation.